insanity. It's the order of the day for the social justice warrior community, and if we do not address it, it may well become the order of the day for all of us. Heaven forbid. Hence the following.
The other day, I was listening to this podcast, and one of the episodes talked about this concept that I had never heard of before, and it explains so much. But just so you know, this video is not sponsored. I just really enjoyed this podcast. I wish I was getting paid to talk about this, but I'm not. So, the podcast is called Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell, and the very first episode is the one I want to tell you about. It's called The Lady Vanishes. And I'm going to be paraphrasing here, but basically, it looked at a few cases in history where it seemed like a glass ceiling had been shattered, but then nothing changed, at least for a long time.
The podcast episode in question, which clearly has Riley as giddy as the schoolboy that he will never cease to be, was actually an extremely boring 30-minute screed with sprinklings of relevant history by a British person who succeeded in being something that I rarely encounter, namely a person with a British accent that is actually extremely wanting in the fine art of oratory. Nevertheless, as to the subject in question, namely the work of art known as roll call, I will simply state the following. I've seen pictures of this particular artwork online, and based on my estimation as an admitted layman, the artwork in question isn't that terribly impressive, and it probably owes its place in British history all but solely to the caprice of Queen Victoria. I've seen the artworks of Adolf Hitler, and his artworks, when you disassociate the man from them, are fairly average and unimpressive. That was exactly the same estimation that I had of this other artwork in question. And I know it's a bit hyperbolic to bring Hitler into this, but just on the off chance that Riley does see this, I wanted to do this just because I'm sure he would find it very offensive, and I find that extraordinarily funny.
The main example is a female painter from a few hundred years ago who becomes extremely famous in her completely male-dominated field. She breaks the glass ceiling of painting. She proves that women can be amazing painters.
Elizabeth Thompson's The Roll Call, the work in question here, was only painted about 150 years ago, so Riley's a little off on his timeline here. And I would not describe the work in question as being amazing, though I will say it was atypical, and that's probably the reason why Queen Victoria took a particular liking to it. It generally exhibits the sort of dry, almost photography-like character of Victorian artworks, and it lacks some of the more abstract elements that made some of those works a bit better than others. It showed a level of competency, but apart from the event that it's depicting, I wouldn't describe it as amazing, more proficient and just making the grade. But again, this is a matter of taste and opinion, and don't treat me as though I'm some sort of refined art critic, which I'm not, but obviously neither is Riley.
But then she fades into the background, and it's a long, long time before the art world opens up to more female painters.
Elizabeth Thompson faded into obscurity primarily because 3 years after the work in question was completed, she chose to marry and to raise 6 children and travel the world. So she doesn't really come off as being some sort of ideal feminist icon, at least according to the definition that Riley and the person who put up the podcast that he's sourcing would like us to believe. Furthermore, she was hardly the only artist at the time who was making waves of varying degrees. I have a link in the description to a page on the Huffington Post of all websites, a website that I would assume someone like Riley would be familiar with, but evidently not, and it lists 13 artists, all of them women, who had comparable accomplishments either during the same time period or in one case a little before her time and the others not much more than 30 years afterwards. So this long time business doesn't really sit well with reality. Of course, then neither does a lot of Riley's beliefs, I'm sorry to say.
The other example was more recent, and it was about the Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who, despite being the Prime Minister, had to face tons of sexism as a part of her job. And then the next Prime Minister was a man, and the one after that, and the one after that.
Julia Gillard did not face a ton of sexism while Prime Minister of Australia. What she faced was a massive backlash over what could be described as the worst reign of power in the history of Australia. You talk to anyone from said nation who is not a dyed-in-the-wool kooky-ass feminist like you, and they will tell you the same thing. She presided over one of the worst regimes in the history of that country, and her own party disowned her.
To figure out why. Why were these women able to achieve such high-ranking positions in the art world or the political world or whatever if their fields clearly still weren't completely accepting of women? The answer was called moral licensing. I had never heard this term before, and I'd always just called it the "I have a black friend" excuse. In that context, I'm sure you've heard it before. Someone says something pretty racist, then follows it up with, "Well, I can't be racist, I have a black friend." This can be used for pretty much any group. You can say anti-trans things and then claim it's okay because you have a trans friend. You can say misogynistic things and then claim it's okay because you have a sister. It's an excuse I've heard so many times, but I never knew there was a term for it, and I definitely didn't know that it had been studied so extensively.
Whoa. Riley, your tangents are running off on their own tangents here. I know you're into this whole intersectional feminism thing, but when you jump from something all but completely unrelated to something else that abruptly, it's hard for our minds to process it all. Nevertheless, I will humor you on one point here, and that is this whole concept of moral licensing, or as you call it, the "I have a black friend" excuse. Who is the one licensing, and who is the one seeking the license? According to your example, both parties are one and the same, ergo the people with power. If somebody has power and wishes to behave in a tyrannical fashion, they don't seek license from themselves to do so for the approval of those beneath them. They simply govern with an iron fist, or they find much more effective ways of keeping people down than giving them access to the education that allows them to excel, which Elizabeth Thompson was afforded, and the same with her female artist contemporaries and recent successors. The bullshit is strong with you, and apparently not much else.
Another way of thinking about it is that it's like if you were to give yourself a pat on the back for doing one progressive thing, and then you thought that excused you from being progressive in other areas. Like with the earlier example, the male painters were thinking, well, we can't be sexist, we had that one female painter.
The artist community of the 19th century was not concerned over appearing progressive. They were concerned with who could paint or sculpt or etch or what have you. And it just so happens that Elizabeth Thompson was not the only one who was recognized at the time, although she was clearly in the minority. There was actually a rather well-renowned and, in my opinion, superior artist by the name of Mary Nimmo Moran from Scotland who achieved similar status, although granted she was an American citizen, not a British one. A simple Google search will debunk most of what Riley is saying here.
So they felt okay denying other female painters any opportunities in the art world.
Do you have an actual source or citation that you can provide to back up this claim? Or, like your pronouns, is this just a figment of your imagination?
Australia thought it had solved sexism when they elected Gillard, so they were able to excuse the terrible behavior shown by Gillard's co-workers.
Julia Gillard was elected primarily because too many people in Australia began thinking like you, ergo with feelings rather than logic. They put a person in charge who was clearly not qualified, and when things started to go south, they corrected the problem. Julia Gillard was a moron, and that's all there is to it. End of story. See you later.
Another example in the podcast was a study done on people who voted for Obama, and it found that they were actually more likely to have racist opinions, because in their minds, they voted for Obama, so they can't be racist.
Yeah, of course. Start with a crazy premise, run with it until you're clean off the map and you sound like a raving lunatic, and then what do? Run even further and you figure, hey, at some point crazy becomes sane, at least in your own mind. For everybody else listening, it's just more crazy. Getting back to reality here. What happened in the 2016 presidential election, at least insofar as the working class white vote in all those states that Obama won, that Trump ended up beating Clinton in, it's very straightforward. These people either have jobs that are in jeopardy or they've lost jobs that they've had for years. And the reason for this was policy decisions. That's what these people were concerned with. Some of it had to do with immigration, and then everybody cries racism when someone says, hey, maybe we should let less people in with lower skills so that they don't take jobs away from the people that currently occupy them. But for the most part, it's a matter of economics. Barack Obama won these people over primarily by playing to them in 2008, whereas John McCain was babbling about wars in the Middle East, which everybody was tired of. Fast forward to 2012, Republicans are gaining the upper hand, and what does Mitt Romney do? He completely alienates the working class by droning on and on about abstract economic theories, which very few people understand. Speaking for myself, I voted for Gary Johnson in 2012. I supported Ron Paul in both of the primaries in question, and I was considering voting third party this time around. The main reason why I decided not to do that was because I thought it would be prudent to elect somebody into office who was less likely to kill a bunch of brown people in the Middle East and stir up more chaos. Hillary Clinton, aka Mrs. I have a vagina and therefore I should be president, was doing nothing but saber rattling. This had nothing to do with racism and everything to do with policy. Can you get that through your fucked up tranny brain, Riley?
I also think that helped people explain away their sexism towards Hillary Clinton. Because whatever your opinions of her are, she faced a ton of sexism in this election from people all across the political spectrum. And people felt okay doing that because they thought they couldn't possibly be sexist because they had supported Elizabeth Warren or Carly Fiorina or voted for a female governor or something like that.
Riley, who the hell are you talking about? I mean, can you give some actual examples of this, even if they're anecdotal, and get a little more specific? Because contrary to what you may have heard, straight guys like me do not think about pussy 24/7, especially when we're in the voting booth. That's more something that wannabe lesbians like you are into, I suppose. Doesn't apply to me.
Even people who are hugely anti-Semitic might not believe they're anti-Semitic because they have a Jewish author that they like, or they went to the Holocaust Museum once or something. I'm just glad there's a term for this so that we can talk about it and try to address it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please make sure that your seatbelts are fastened and that your tray tables are in the upright position, for we are now entering the threshold of epistemological Armageddon. We know you have a choice in airlines, and evidently you made the wrong one.
Racism, sexism, or any kind of bigotry is not solved in a single act. It's something that we actively fight against every day, and we need to be aware of that. And just because you know one person from a specific group doesn't mean you get to make sweeping judgments about that entire group or speak on behalf of that group.
The hashtag not all moments in this video are starting to reach infinite regression territory here. Riley, I don't think I have ever heard of a person presumed to speak for all of the people of another group to which they do not belong. Maybe Jesse Jackson would apply to that if we would presume to separate black people who actually succeed in life from those that are stuck in the hood in single mother households and have nothing to look forward to except for a life of crime and probably an early death. And on that front, we get into the second point. Most of the time when people criticize the shortcomings of another group of people, it relies on factual, statistical data, and it obviously does not apply to everyone. When I criticize thug culture, for example, it naturally precludes those who are successful in life and who do not come from broken homes, or who do come from broken homes and overcome in spite of that.
Anyways, that's all I had for you today. Let me know in the comments if you've ever run into moral licensing in your life, and be sure to share this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
And we're going to be cutting that crap short again because I like to keep the auditory homosexuality down to a minimum here, at least as far as music is concerned. I've got to hand it to Riley on this one. This is without a doubt the most scatterbrained excuse for a video I have ever seen out of any brand of social justice warrior. That's quite an accomplishment. The whole idea of moral licensing is a fictional syllogism created by people who are hell-bent on destroying Western civilization through the destruction of logical thought. And every person that gets sucked into this crap is one more notch in the belt on the way to making that a reality. Do me a favor. This video has already received a fair amount of hate already, but it needs more. So if you're subscribed to me, and if you were as abhorred by what you saw and heard as I was, get over there and thumb that piece of crap down. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.